Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2021 edition of Socialism for All. Specifically, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. The USA needs to do much more than simply name a holiday after people it has genocided and is still oppressing. But anyway, that is today. And in this file, we're doing excerpts, specifically the introduction and Chapter 8 from An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text is one of several that we have done, which are recommended texts from therednation.org. That's thered, R-E-D, nation.org. Please go check out their website. They have quite a number of resources, and they've made educational materials available for people to make avail of. This particular text is from 2014, and without further ado, let's start to read it. Introduction. This land. Quote, "We are here to educate, not forgive. We are here to enlighten, not accuse." Unquote. Quoting Willie Johns, Brighton Seminole Reservation, Florida. Under the crust of that portion of Earth called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream waters, are interred the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of American Indians. They cry out for their stories to be heard through their descendants who carry the memories of how the country was founded and how it came to be as it is today. It should not have happened that the great civilizations of the Western Hemisphere, the very evidence of the Western Hemisphere, were wantonly destroyed, the gradual process of humanity interrupted, and set upon a path of greed and destruction. Choices were made that forged that path toward destruction of life itself, the moment in which we now live and die as our planet shrivels, overheated. To learn and know this history is both a necessity and a responsibility to the ancestors and descendants of all parties. What historian David Chang has written about the land that became Oklahoma applies to the whole United States. Quote, "Nation, race, and class converged in land." Unquote. Everything in U.S. history is about the land, who oversaw and cultivated it, fished its waters, maintained its wildlife, who invaded and stole it, how it became a commodity, real estate, broken into pieces to be bought and sold on the market. U.S. policies and actions related to indigenous peoples, though often termed racist or discriminatory, are rarely depicted as what they are: classic cases of imperialism and a particular form of colonialism, settler colonialism. As anthropologist Patrick Wolf writes, quote, "The question of genocide is never far from discussions of settler colonialism. Land is life, or at least, land is necessary for life." Unquote. The history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism, the founding of a state based on the ideology of white supremacy, the widespread practice of African slavery, and a policy of genocide and land theft. Those who seek history with an upbeat ending, a history of redemption and reconciliation, may look around and observe that such a conclusion is not visible, not even in utopian dreams of a better society. Writing U.S. history from an indigenous people's perspective requires rethinking the consensual national narrative. That narrative is wrong or deficient, not in its facts, dates, or details, but rather in its essence. Inherent in the myth that we've been taught is an embrace of settler colonialism and genocide. The myth persists not for lack of free speech or poverty of information, but rather for an absence of motivation to ask questions that challenge the core of the scripted narrative of the origin story. How might acknowledging the reality of U.S. history work to transform society? That is the central question that this book pursues. Teaching Native American studies, I always begin with a simple exercise. I ask students to quickly draw a rough outline of the United States at the time that it gained independence from Britain. Invariably, most draw the approximate present shape of the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the continental territory not fully appropriated until a century after independence. What became independent in 1783 were the 13 British colonies hugging the Atlantic shore. When called on this, students are embarrassed because they know better. I assure them that they're not alone. I call this a Rorschach test of unconscious manifest destiny, embedded in the minds of nearly everyone in the United States and around the world. The test reflects the seeming inevitability of U.S. extent and power, its destiny, with an implication that the continent had previously been terra nullius, a land without people. Woody Guthrie's "This Land is Your Land" celebrates that the land belongs to everyone, reflecting the unconscious manifest destiny we live with. But the extension of the United States from sea to shining sea was the intention and design of the country's founders. Quote, "Free land" was the magnet that attracted European settlers. Many were slave owners who desired limitless land for lucrative cash crops. After the War for Independence, but preceding the writing of the U.S. Constitution, the Continental Congress produced the Northwest Ordinance. This was the first law of the incipient republic, revealing the motive for those desiring independence. It was the blueprint for gobbling up the British-protected Indian Territory, or Ohio Country, on the other side of the Appalachians and Alleghenies. Britain had made settlement there illegal with the Proclamation of 1763. In 1801, President Jefferson aptly described the new settler states' intentions for horizontal and vertical continental expansion, stating, quote, "However our present interests may restrain us within our own limits, it is not impossible to look forward to distant times, when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits, and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws." Unquote. This vision of manifest destiny found form a few years later in the Monroe Doctrine, signaling the intention of annexing or dominating former Spanish colonial territories in the Americas and the Pacific, which would be put into practice during the rest of the century. Origin narratives form the vital core of a people's unifying identity and of the values that guide them. In the United States, the founding and development of the Anglo-American settler state involves a narrative about Puritan settlers who had a covenant with God to take the land. That part of the origin story is supported and reinforced by the Columbus myth and the doctrine of discovery. According to a series of late 15th century papal bulls, European nations acquired title to the lands they, quote, "discovered," and the indigenous inhabitants lost their natural right to that land after Europeans arrived and claimed it. As law professor Robert A. Williams observes about the doctrine of discovery, quote, "Responding to the requirements of a paradoxical age of Renaissance and Inquisition, the West's first modern discourses of conquest articulated a vision of all humankind united under a rule of law, discoverable solely by human reason. Unfortunately for the American Indian, the West's first tentative steps toward this noble vision of a law of nations contained a mandate for Europe's subjugation of all peoples whose radical divergence from European-derived norms of right conduct signified their need for conquest and remediation." Unquote. The Columbus myth suggests that from U.S. independence onward, colonial settlers saw themselves as part of a world system of colonization. Columbia, the poetic Latinate name used in reference to the United States, from its founding throughout the 19th century, was based on the name of Christopher Columbus. The land of Columbus was, and still is, represented by the image of a woman in sculptures and paintings, by institutions such as Columbia University, and by countless place names, including that of the national capital, the District of Columbia. The 1798 hymn, "Hail Columbia," was the early national anthem, and is now used whenever the Vice President of the United States makes a public appearance, and Columbus Day is still a federal holiday, despite Columbus never having set foot on the continent claimed by the United States. Traditionally, historians of the United States, hoping to have successful careers in academia and to author lucrative school textbooks, became protectors of this origin myth. With the cultural upheavals in the academic world during the 1960s, engendered by the civil rights movement and student activism, historians came to call for objectivity and fairness in revising interpretations of U.S. history. They warned against moralizing, urging instead a dispassionate and culturally relative approach. Historian Bernard Sheehan, in an influential essay, called for a cultural conflict understanding of Native Euro-American relations in the early United States, writing that this approach, quote, diffuses the locus of guilt, unquote. In striving for, quote, balance, however, historians spouted platitudes, quote, there were good and bad people on both sides. Wow, that sounds familiar. American culture is an amalgamation of all its ethnic groups. A frontier is a zone of interaction between cultures, not merely advancing European settlements. Later, trendy postmodernist studies insisted on indigenous, quote, agency, under the guise of individual and collective empowerment, making the casualties of colonialism responsible for their own demise. Perhaps worst of all, some claimed, and still claim, that the colonizer and colonized experienced a, quote, encounter and engaged in, quote, dialogue, thereby masking reality with justifications and rationalizations. In short, apologies for one-sided robbery and murder. In focusing on cultural change and conflict between cultures, these studies avoid fundamental questions about the formation of the United States and its implications for the present and future. This approach to history allows one to safely put aside present responsibility for continued harm done by that past and the questions of reparations, restitution, and reordering society. Multiculturalism became the cutting edge of post-civil rights movement U.S. history revisionism. For this scheme to work and affirm U.S. historical progress, indigenous nations and communities had to be left out of the picture. As territorially and treaty-based peoples in North America, they did not fit into the grid of multiculturalism, but were included by transforming them into an inchoate, oppressed racial group, while colonized Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans were dissolved into another such group, variously called Hispanic or Latino. The multicultural approach emphasized the contributions of individuals from oppressed groups to the country's assumed greatness. Indigenous peoples were thus credited with corn, beans, buckskin, log cabins, parkas, maple syrup, canoes, hundreds of place names, Thanksgiving, and even the concepts of democracy and federalism. But this idea of the gift-giving Indians helped to establish and enrich the development of the United States is an insidious smokescreen meant to obscure the fact that the very existence of the country is the result of the looting of an entire continent and its resources. The fundamental unresolved issues of indigenous lands, treaties, and sovereignty could not but scuttle the premises of multiculturalism. With multiculturalism, Manifest Destiny won the day. As an example, in 1994, Prentice Hall, part of Pearson Education, published a new college-level U.S. history textbook, authored by 4 members of a new generation of revisionist historians. These radical social historians are all brilliant scholars with posts in prestigious universities. The book's title reflects the intent of its authors and publisher. Title is Out of Many, A History of the American People. The origin story of a supposedly unitary nation, albeit now multicultural, remained intact. The original cover design featured a multicolored woven fabric, this image meant to stand in place of the discredited melting pot. Inside, facing the title page, was a photograph of a Navajo woman, dressed formally in velvet and adorned with heavy sterling silver and turquoise jewelry. With a traditional Navajo dwelling, a hogan, in the background, the woman was shown kneeling in front of a traditional loom, weaving a nearly finished rug. The design? The Stars and Stripes. The authors, upon hearing my objection and explanation that Navajo weavers make their livings off commissioned work that includes the desired design, responded, "But it's a real photograph." To the author's credit, in the second edition they replaced the cover photograph and removed the Navajo picture inside, although the narrative text remains unchanged. Awareness of the settler colonialist context of U.S. history writing is essential if one is to avoid the laziness of the default position and the trap of a mythological unconscious belief in manifest destiny. The form of colonialism that the indigenous peoples of North America have experienced was modern from the beginning. The expansion of European corporations, backed by government armies, into foreign areas, with subsequent expropriation of lands and resources. Settler colonialism is a genocidal policy. Native nations and communities, while struggling to maintain fundamental values and collectivity, have from the beginning resisted modern colonialism using both defensive and offensive techniques, including the modern forms of armed resistance of national liberation movements and what is now called terrorism. In every instance, they have fought for survival as peoples. The objective of U.S. colonialist authorities was to terminate their existence as peoples, not as random individuals. This is the very definition of modern genocide, as contrasted with pre-modern instances of extreme violence that did not have the goal of extinction. The U.S., as a socioeconomic and political entity, is a result of this centuries-long and ongoing colonial process. Modern indigenous nations and communities are societies formed by their resistance to colonialism, through which they have carried their practices and histories. It is breathtaking, but no miracle, that they have survived as peoples. To say that the United States is a colonialist settler state is not to make an accusation, but rather to face historical reality, without which consideration not much in U.S. history makes sense, unless indigenous peoples are erased. But indigenous nations, through resistance, have survived and bear witness to this history. In the era of worldwide decolonization in the second half of the 20th century, the former colonial powers and their intellectual apologists mounted a counterforce, often called Neo-Colonialism, from which multiculturalism and postmodernism emerged. Although much revisionist U.S. history reflects neo-colonialist strategy, an attempt to accommodate new realities in order to retain the dominance, neo-colonialist methods signal victory for the colonized. Such approaches pry off a lid long kept tightly fastened. One result has been the presence of significant numbers of indigenous scholars in U.S. universities who are changing the terms of analysis. The main challenge for scholars in revising U.S. history in the context of colonialism is not lack of information, nor is it one of methodology. Certainly difficulties with documentation are no more problematic than they are in any other area of research. Rather, the source of the problems has been the refusal or inability of U.S. historians to comprehend the nature of their own history, U.S. history. The fundamental problem is the absence of the colonial framework. Through economic penetration of indigenous societies, the European and Euro-American colonial powers created economic dependency and imbalance of trade, then incorporated the indigenous nations into spheres of influence and controlled them indirectly or as protectorates, with indispensable use of Christian missionaries and alcohol. In the case of U.S. settler colonialism, land was the primary commodity. With such obvious indicators of colonialism at work, why should so many interpretations of U.S. political economic development be convoluted and obscure, avoiding the obvious? To some extent, the 20th century emergence of the field of U.S. West, or borderlands history, has been forced into an incomplete and flawed settler colonialist framework. The father of that field of history, Frederick Jackson Turner, confessed as much in 1901, quote, "Our colonial system did not start with the Spanish War, 1898. The U.S. had had a colonial history and policy from the beginning of the Republic, but they have been hidden under the phraseology of interstate migration and territorial organization," unquote. Settler colonialism as an institution or system requires violence or the threat of violence to attain its goals. People do not hand over their land, resources, children, and futures without a fight, and that fight is met with violence. In employing the force necessary to accomplish its expansionist goals, a colonizing regime institutionalizes violence. The notion that settler-indigenous conflict is an inevitable product of cultural differences and misunderstandings, or that violence was committed equally by the colonized and the colonizer, blurs the nature of the historical processes. Euro-American colonialism, an aspect of the capitalist economic globalization, had from its beginnings a genocidal tendency. The term genocide was coined following the Shoah, or Holocaust, and its prohibition was enshrined in the United Nations Convention adopted in 1948, the U.S. Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The convention is not retroactive, but is applicable to U.S. indigenous relations since 1988, when the U.S. Senate ratified it. Quick comment there. Note that there was 40 years that passed before the U.S. Senate ratified this UN convention. The U.S., this is so typical of the U.S. in recognizing many different forms of rights. They're very quick, generally, to recognize political rights, i.e. the freedom to participate in basically sham capitalist elections where you just pick who's going to be oppressing you. But when it comes to economic rights, or obviously things like this, which the U.S. is massively guilty of itself, 40 years, if ever. Okay. The terms of the Genocide Convention are also useful tools for historical analysis of the effects of colonialism in any era. In the convention, any one of 5 acts is considered genocide if, quote, committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, unquote. And these are the 5 acts or criteria here. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In the 1990s, the term ethnic cleansing became a useful descriptive term for genocide. The U.S. history, as well as inherited indigenous trauma, cannot be understood without dealing with the genocide that the United States committed against indigenous peoples. From the colonial period through the founding of the United States and continuing in the 21st century, this has entailed torture, terror, sexual abuse, massacres, systematic military occupations, removals of indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, and removals of indigenous children to military-like boarding schools. The absence of even the slightest note of regret or tragedy in the annual celebration of the U.S. independence betrays a deep disconnect in the consciousness of U.S. Americans. Another comment there, that is a brilliant term, and I have actually thought about this before, and I never came up with it myself, so deep thanks to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for U.S. Americans. You don't want to say just Americans, because everything is America. There's North America, there's South America, and so on. There's no convenient form of United Statesian or Statesian or anything like that. U.S. Americans is perfect. Now I don't have to say people in the U.S. anymore. Wonderful. All right. Settler colonialism is inherently genocidal in terms of the Genocide Convention. In the case of the British North American colonies and the United States, not only extermination and removal were practiced, but also the disappearing of the prior existence of indigenous peoples, and this continues to be perpetuated in local histories. Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe historian Gene O'Brien, names this practice of writing Indians out of existence, quote, firsting and lasting. All over the continent, local histories, monuments, and signage narrate the story of first settlement, the founders, the first school, the first dwelling, the first everything, as if there had never been occupants who thrived in those places before Euro-Americans. On the other hand, the national narrative tells of last Indians or last tribes, such as the last of the Mohicans, Ishi, the last Indian, and the end of the trail, as a famous sculpture by James Earl Fraser is titled. Documented policies of genocide on the part of U.S. administrations can be identified in at least 4 distinct periods. The Jacksonian era of forced removal, the California Gold Rush in Northern California, the post-Civil War era of the so-called Indian Wars in the Great Plains, and the 1950s termination period, all of which are discussed in the following chapters. Cases of genocide carried out as policy may be found in historical documents as well as in the oral histories of indigenous communities. An example from 1873 is typical, with General William T. Sherman writing, quote, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination. Men, women, and children, during an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even discriminate as to age," unquote. As Patrick Wolfe has noted, the peculiarity of settler colonialism is that the goal is elimination of indigenous populations in order to make land available to settlers. That project is not limited to government policy, but rather involves all kinds of agencies, voluntary militias, and the settlers themselves acting on their own. In the wake of the U.S. 1950s termination and relocation policies, a pan-indigenous movement arose in tandem with the powerful African American civil rights movement and the broad-based social justice and anti-war movements of the 1960s. The indigenous rights movement succeeded in reversing the U.S. termination policy. However, repression, armed attacks, and legislative attempts to undo treaty rights began again in the late 1970s, giving rise to the International Indigenous Movement, which greatly broadened the support for indigenous sovereignty and territorial rights in the United States. The early 21st century has seen increased exploitation of energy resources begetting new pressures on indigenous lands, exploitation by the largest corporations, often in collusion with politicians at local, state, and federal levels, and even within some indigenous governments, could spell a final demise for indigenous land bases and resources. Strengthening indigenous sovereignty and self-determination to prevent that result will take general public outrage and demand, which in turn will require that the general population, those descended from settlers and immigrants, know their history and assume responsibility. I'm going to repeat that sentence again. Strengthening indigenous sovereignty and self-determination to prevent that result will take general public outrage and demand, which in turn will require that the general population, those descended from settlers and immigrants, know their history and assume responsibility. And that is why I'm reading this book on the channel here for you, the S4A audience. Please spread it wide. Resistance to these powerful corporate forces continues to have profound implications for U.S. socioeconomic and political development and the future. There are more than 500 federally recognized indigenous communities and nations, comprising nearly 3 million people in the United States. These are the descendants of the 15 million original inhabitants of the land, the majority of whom were farmers who lived in towns. The U.S. establishment of a system of Indian reservations stemmed from a long British colonial practice in the Americas. In the era of U.S. treaty making from independence to 1871, the concept of the reservation was one of the indigenous nation reserving a narrowed land base from a much larger one in exchange for U.S. government protection from settlers and the provision of social services. So comment, that half of that is literally just a protection racket. The U.S. government's like, gee, nice land and communities you got here. Sure be a pity if one of our settlers got out of control. I mean, the settlers we brought here got, out of control and, wrecked your stuff. It's amazing. Anyway, in the late 19th century, as indigenous resistance was weakened, the concept of the reservation changed to one of land being carved out of the public domain of the United States as a benevolent gesture or a, quote, gift to the indigenous peoples. Rhetoric changed so that reservations were said to have been given or created for Indians. With this shift, Indian reservations came to be seen as enclaves within state boundaries. Despite the political and economic reality, the impression to many was that indigenous people were taking a free ride on U.S. public domain. Okay, so commenting just so that my comment, which interrupted the flow a little bit, doesn't overshadow the point there is a transition from early on, from basically independence to 1871, recognizing that the land is, lived on by indigenous people, it's their land, etc. And then there's a shift after this towards, well, it's the U.S. land and we're going to, quote, give it to you. Just wanted to re-emphasize that point in case my interruption of the flow impeded it for you. Okay. Beyond the land bases within the limits of the 310 federally recognized reservations, among 554 indigenous groups, indigenous land, water, and resource rights extend to all federally acknowledged indigenous communities within the borders of the United States. This is the case whether, quote, within the original or subsequently acquired territory thereof, and whether within or without the limits of a state, unquote, and includes all allotments as well as rights of way running to and from them. Not all the federally recognized indigenous nations have land bases beyond government buildings, and the lands of some native nations, including those of the Sioux in the Dakotas and Minnesota, and the Ojibways in Minnesota, have been parceled into multiple reservations, while some 50 indigenous nations that had been removed to Oklahoma were entirely allotted, divided by the federal government into individual native-owned parcels. Attorney Walter R. Echohawk writes, quote, in 1881, Indian land holdings in the United States had plummeted to 156 million acres. By 1934, only about 50 million acres remained, an area about the size of Idaho and Washington, as a result of the General Allotment Act of 1887. During World War II, the government took 500,000 more acres for military use. Over 100 tribes, bands, and rancherias relinquished their lands under various acts of Congress during the termination era of the 1950s. By 1955, the indigenous land base had shrunk to just 2.3% of its original size, unquote. As a result of federal land sales, seizures, and allotments, most reservations are severely fragmented. Each parcel of tribal, trust, and privately held land is a separate enclave under multiple laws and jurisdictions. The Diné Navajo Nation has the largest contemporary contiguous land base among native nations, nearly 16 million acres, or nearly 25,000 square miles, the size of West Virginia. Each of 12 other reservations is larger than Rhode Island, which comprises nearly 800,000 acres, or 1,200 square miles, and each of 9 other reservations is larger than Delaware, which covers nearly 1.5 million acres, or 2,000 square miles. Other reservations have land bases of fewer than 32,000 acres, or 50 square miles. A number of independent nation states with seats in the United Nations have less territory and smaller populations than some indigenous nations of North America. Following World War II, the United States was at war with much of the world, just as it was at war with the indigenous peoples of North America in the 19th century. This was total war, demanding that the enemy surrender unconditionally or face annihilation. Perhaps it was inevitable that the earlier wars against indigenous peoples, if not acknowledged and repudiated, ultimately would include the world. According to the origin narrative, the United States was born of rebellion against oppression, against empire, and thus it is the product of the first anti-colonial revolution for national liberation. The narrative flows from that fallacy, the broadening and deepening of democracy, the Civil War and the ensuing Second Revolution, which ended slavery, the 20th century mission to save Europe from itself, twice, and the ultimately triumphant fight against the scourge of communism, with the United States inheriting the difficult and burdensome task of keeping order in the world. It's a narrative of progress. The 1960s social revolutions, ignited by the African American liberation movement, complicated the origin narrative, but its structure and periodization have been left intact. After the 1960s, historians incorporated women, African Americans, and immigrants as contributors to the commonweal. Indeed, the revised narrative produced the, quote, nation of immigrants framework, which obscures the U.S. practice of colonization, merging settler colonialism with immigration to metropolitan centers during and after the Industrial Revolution. Native peoples, to the extent that they were included at all, were renamed First Americans and thus themselves cast as distant immigrants. The provincialism and national chauvinism of U.S. history production make it difficult for effective revisions to gain authority. Scholars, both indigenous and a few non-indigenous, who attempt to rectify the distortions are labeled advocates, and their findings are rejected for publication on that basis. Indigenous scholars look to research and thinking that has emerged in the rest of the European colonized world. To understand the historical and current experiences of indigenous peoples in the United States, these thinkers and writers draw upon and creatively apply the historical materialism of Marxism, the liberation theology of Latin America, Frantz Fanon's psychosocial analyses of the effects of colonialism on the colonizer and the colonized, and other approaches, including development theory and postmodern theory, while not abandoning insights gained from those sources. Due to the, quote, exceptional nature of U.S. colonialism among 19th century colonial powers, indigenous scholars and activists are engaged in exploring new approaches. This book claims to be a history of the United States from an indigenous people's perspective, but there is no such thing as a collective indigenous people's perspective, just as there is no monolithic Asian or European or African people's perspective. This is not a history of the vast civilizations and communities that thrived and survived between the Gulf of Mexico and Canada, and between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific. Such histories have been written and are being written by historians of Diné, Lakota, Mohawk, Tlingit, Muskogee, Anishinaabe, Lumbee, Inuit, Kiowa, Cherokee, Hopi, and other indigenous communities and nations that have survived colonial genocide. This book attempts to tell the story of the United States as a colonialist settler state, one that, like colonialist European states, crushed and subjugated the original civilizations in the territories it now rules. Indigenous peoples, now in a colonial relationship with the United States, inhabited and thrived for millennia before they were displaced to fragmented reservations and economically decimated. This is a history of the United States. So that's the end of the introduction. As this audiobook is excerpts from this book, we now skip to Chapter 8, Indian Country. Quote, "Buffalo were dark, rich clouds moving upon the rolling hills and plains of America, and then the flashing steel came upon bone and flesh." Unquote. Quoting Simon J. Ortiz from Sand Creek. The U.S. Army, on the eve of the Civil War, was divided into 7 departments, a structure designed by John C. Calhoun during the Monroe administration. By 1860, 6 of the 7 departments, comprising 183 companies, were stationed west of the Mississippi, a colonial army fighting the indigenous occupants of the land. In much of the western lands, the Army was the primary U.S. government institution. The military roots to institutional development run deep. President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated in March 1861, 2 months after the South had seceded from the Union. In April, the Confederate States of America, CSA, seized the Army base at Fort Sumter near Charleston, South Carolina. Of more than 1,000 U.S. Army officers, 286 left to serve the CSA, half of them being West Point graduates, most of them Indian fighters, including Robert E. Lee. 3 of the 7 Army Department commanders took leadership of the Confederate Army. Based on demographics alone, the South had little chance of winning, so it is all the more remarkable that it persisted against the Union for more than 4 years. The 1860 population of the United States was nearly 32 million, with 23 million in the 22 northern states and about 9 million in the 11 southern states. More than a third of the 9 million Southerners were enslaved people of African heritage. Within the CSA, 76% of settlers owned no slaves. Roughly 60 to 70% of those without slaves owned fewer than 100 acres of land. Less than 1% owned more than 100 slaves. 17% of settlers in the South owned 1 to 9 slaves, and only 6.5% owned more than 10. 10% of the settlers who owned no slaves were also landless, while that many more managed to barely survive on small dirt farms. The Confederate Army reflected the same kind of percentages. Those who, even today, claim that states' rights caused Southern secession in the Civil War use these statistics to argue that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, but that is false. Every settler in the southern states aspired to own land and slaves, or to own more land and more slaves, as both social status and wealth depended on the extent of property owned. Even small and landless farmers relied on slavery-based rule. The local slave plantation was the market for what small farmers produced, and planters hired landless settlers as overseers and sharecroppers. Most non-slave-owning settlers supported and fought for the Confederacy. Also, quick comment, if you read the statement put out by South Carolina, it mentions slavery directly. Okay. Lincoln's, quote, free soil for settlers. Abraham Lincoln's campaign for the presidency appealed to the vote of land-poor settlers who demanded that the government, quote, open indigenous lands west of the Mississippi. They were called free soilers, in reference to cheap land free of slavery. New gold rushes and other incentives brought new waves of settlers to squat on indigenous land. For this reason, some indigenous people preferred a Confederate victory, which might divide and weaken the United States, which had grown ever more powerful. Indigenous nations in Indian Territory were more directly affected by the Civil War than anywhere else. As discussed in Chapter 6, the Southeastern Nations, the Cherokees, Muskogees, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, or the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, were forcibly removed from their homelands during the Jackson administration. But in the Indian Territories, they rebuilt their townships, farms, ranches, and institutions, including newspapers, schools, and orphanages. Although a tiny elite of each nation was wealthy and owned enslaved Africans and private estates, the majority of the people continued their collective agrarian practices. All 5 nations signed treaties with the Confederacy, each for similar reasons. Within each nation, however, there was a clear division based on class, often misleadingly expressed as a conflict between, quote, mixed bloods and, quote, full bloods. That is, the wealthy, assimilated, slave-owning minority that dominated politics favored the Confederacy, and the non-slave-owning poor and traditional majority wanted to stay out of the Anglo-American Civil War. Historian David Chang found that Muskogee nationalism and well-founded distrust of federal power played a major role in bringing about that nation's strategic alliance with the Confederacy. Chang writes, quote, was the Creek Council's alliance with the South a racist defense of slavery and its class privileges, or was it a nationalist defense of Creek lands and sovereignty? The answer has to be both, unquote. John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, at first called for neutrality, but changed his mind for reasons similar to the Muskogees and asked the Cherokee Council for authority to negotiate a treaty with the CSA. Nearly 7,000 men of the 5 nations went into battle for the Confederacy. Stan Watty, a Cherokee, held the post of brigadier general in the Confederate Army. His 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi was among the last units in the field to surrender to the Union Army on June 23, 1865, more than 2 months after Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. During the war, however, many indigenous soldiers became disillusioned and went over to the Union forces, along with enslaved African Americans who fled to freedom. Another story is equally important, though less often told. A few months after the war broke out, some 10,000 men in Indian Territory, made up of indigenous volunteers, along with African Americans who had freed themselves, and even some Anglo-Americans, engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Confederate Army. They fought from Oklahoma into Kansas, where many of them joined unofficial Union units that had been organized by abolitionists who had trained with John Brown years earlier. This was not likely the kind of war the Lincoln administration had desired, a multi-ethnic volunteer Union contingent fighting pro-slavery forces in Missouri, where enslaved Africans escaped to join the Union side. The self-liberation by African Americans, occurring all over the South, led to Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed freed Africans to serve in combat. In Minnesota, which had become a non-slavery state in 1859, the Dakota Sioux were on the verge of starvation by 1862, when they mounted an uprising to drive out the mostly German and Scandinavian settlers. Union Army troops crushed the revolt, slaughtering Dakota civilians and rounding up several hundred men. 300 prisoners were sentenced to death, but upon Lincoln's orders to reduce the numbers, 38 were selected at random to die in the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. The revered leader Little Crow was not among those hanged, but was assassinated the following summer while out picking raspberries with his son. The assassin, a settler farmer, collected a $500 bounty. One of the young Dakota survivors asked his uncle about the mysterious white people who would commit such crimes. The uncle replied, quote, "Certainly they are a heartless nation. They have made some of their people servants, yes, slaves. The greatest object of their lives seems to be to acquire possessions, to be rich. They desire to possess the whole world. For 30 years they were trying to entice us to sell them our land. Finally, the outbreak gave them all, and we have been driven away from our beautiful country." Unquote. The Genocidal Army of the West. To free the professional soldiers posted in the West to fight against the Confederate Army in the East, Lincoln called for volunteers in the West, and settlers responded, coming from Texas, Kansas, California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Nebraska, Utah, and Nevada. Having few Confederates to fight, they attacked people closer to hand, indigenous people. Land speculators in the Trans-Mississippi West sought statehood for the occupied former Mexican territories in order to attract settlers and investors. Their eagerness to undertake the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous residents to achieve the necessary population balance to attain statehood generated strong anti-Indian hysteria and violent actions. Preoccupied with the Civil War in the East, the Lincoln administration did little to prevent vicious and even genocidal actions on the part of territorial authorities consisting of volunteer Indian haters such as Kit Carson. The mode of maintaining settler law and order set the pattern for post-war genocide. In the most infamous incident involving militias, the 1st and 3rd Colorado Volunteers carried out the Sand Creek Massacre. Although assigned to guard the road to Santa Fe, the units mainly engaged in raiding and looting indigenous communities. John Chivington, an ambitious politician known as the Fighting Parson, led the 3rd Colorado. By 1861, displaced and captive Cheyennes and Arapahoes, under the leadership of the great peace seeker Black Kettle, were incarcerated in a U.S. military reservation called Sand Creek near Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. They camped under a white flag of truce and had federal permission to hunt buffalo to feed themselves. In early 1864, the Colorado territorial governor informed them that they could no longer leave the reservation to hunt. Despite their compliance with the order, on November 29, 1864, Chivington took 700 Colorado volunteers to the reservation. Without provocation or warning, they attacked, leaving dead 105 women and children and 28 men. Even the federal commissioner of Indian Affairs denounced the action, saying that the people had been, quote, "butchered in cold blood by troops in the service of the United States." In its 1865 investigation, the Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War recorded testimonies and published a report that documented the aftermath of the killings when Chivington and his volunteers burned teepees and stole horses. Worse, after the smoke had cleared, they had returned and finished off the few survivors while scalping and mutilating the corpses, women and men, young and old, children, babies. Then they decorated their weapons and caps with body parts, fetuses, penises, breasts, and vulvas, and in the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, quote, "stuck them on their hats to dry, their fingers greasy and slick," unquote. Once back in Denver, they displayed the trophies to the adoring public in Denver's Apollo Theater and in saloons. Yet, despite the detailed report of the deeds, neither Chivington nor any of his men were reprimanded or prosecuted, signaling a free field for killing. U.S. Army Colonel James Carleton formed the Volunteer Army of the Pacific in 1861, based in California. In Nevada and Utah, a California businessman, Colonel Patrick Connor, commanded a militia of 1,000 California volunteers that spent the war years massacring hundreds of unarmed Shoshone, Bannock, and Ute people in their encampments. Carleton led another contingent of militias to Arizona to suppress the Apaches, who were resisting colonization under their great leader, Cochise. At the time, Cochise observed, quote, "When I was young, I walked all over this country, east and west, and saw no other people than the Apaches. After many summers I walked home, and found another race of people had come to take it. How is it? Why is it that the Apaches wait to die, that they carry their lives on their fingernails? The Apaches were once a great nation. They are now but few. Most have been killed in battle." Unquote. Following a scorched earth campaign against the Apaches, Carleton was promoted to the rank of brigadier general and placed in command of the Department of New Mexico. He brought in the now seasoned killing machine of Colorado volunteers to attack the Navajos, on whom he declared total war. He enlisted as his principal commander in the field the ubiquitous Indian killer Kit Carson, with unlimited authority and answering to no one. Carleton spent the entire Civil War in the Southwest, engaged in a series of search and destroy missions against the Navajos. The campaign culminated in March 1864 in a 300-mile forced march of 8,000 Navajo civilians to a military concentration camp at Bosque Redondo in the southeastern New Mexico desert, at the Army base at Fort Sumner, an ordeal recalled in Navajo oral history as the, quote, long walk. One Navajo named Herrero said, quote, "Some of the soldiers do not treat us well. When at work, if we stop a little, they kick us or do something else. We do not mind if an officer punishes us, but do not like to be treated badly by the soldiers. Our women sometimes come to the tents outside the fort and make contracts with the soldiers to stay with them for a night and give them $5 or something else. But in the morning they take away what they gave them and kick them off. This happens most every day." Unquote. At least a fourth of the incarcerated died of starvation. Not until 1868 were the Navajos released and allowed to return to their homeland in what is today called the Four Corners area. This permission to return was not based on the deadly conditions of the camp, rather that Congress determined that the incarceration was too expensive to maintain. For these noble deeds, Carleton was appointed a major general in the U.S. Army in 1865. Now he led the 4th Cavalry in scorched earth forays against Plains Indians. These military campaigns against indigenous nations constituted foreign wars fought during the U.S. Civil War, but the end of the Civil War didn't end them. They carried on unabated to the end of the century, with added killing technology and more seasoned killers, including African American cavalry units. Demobilized officers and soldiers often could not find jobs, and along with a new generation of young settlers, otherwise unemployed and often seeking violent adventure, they joined the Army of the West, some of the officers accepting lower ranks in order to get career Army assignments. Given that war was centered in the West, and that military achievement had come to foster prestige, wealth, and political power, every West Point graduate fought to further his career by volunteering in the Army. Some of their diaries echo those of combat troops in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, who later were troubled by the atrocities they witnessed or committed, but most soldiers persevered in their ambition to succeed. Prominent Civil War generals led the Army of the West, among them Generals William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, to whom is ascribed the statement, quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," George Armstrong Custer, and Nelson A. Miles. The Army would make effective use after 1865 of innovations made during the Civil War. The rapid-fire Gatling gun, first used in battle in 1862, would be employed during the rest of the century against indigenous civilians. Non-technological innovations were perhaps even more important, the Civil War having fostered an extreme patriotic ideology in the Union Army that carried over into the Indian Wars. Now more centralized under presidential command, U.S. forces relied less on state contributions and were thus less subject to their control. The prestige of the Department of War rose within the federal government, so that it had far more leeway to send troops to steamroll over indigenous peoples who challenged U.S. dominion. The Union Army victory over the Confederate Army transformed the South into a quasi-captive nation, a region that remains the poorest of the United States well over a century later. The situation was similar to that in South Africa 2 decades later when the British defeated the Boers, descendants of the original 17th century Dutch settlers. As the British would later do with the Boers, the U.S. government eventually allowed the defeated Southern elite to return to their locally powerful positions, and both U.S. Southerners and Boers soon gained national political power. The powerful white supremacist Southern ruling class helped to further militarize the United States, the Army practically becoming a Southern institution. Following the effective Reconstruction experiment to empower former slaves, the U.S. occupying army was withdrawn, and African Americans were returned to quasi-bondage and disenfranchisement through Jim Crow laws, forming a colonized population in the South. Colonial policy precedes military implementation. In the midst of war, Lincoln did not forget his free soiler settler constituency, which had raised him to the presidency. During the Civil War, with the southern states unrepresented, Congress at Lincoln's behest passed the Homestead Act in 1862, as well as the Morrill Act, the latter transferring large tracts of indigenous land to the states to establish land-grant universities. The Pacific Railroad Act provided private companies with nearly 200 million acres of indigenous land. With these land grabs, the U.S. government broke multiple treaties with indigenous nations. Most of the western territories, including Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, were delayed in achieving statehood because indigenous nations resisted appropriation of their lands and outnumbered settlers. So the colonization plan for the West, established during the Civil War, was carried out over the following 3 decades of war and land grabs. Under the Homestead Act, 1.5 million homesteads were granted to settlers west of the Mississippi, comprising nearly 300 million acres, or 500,000 square miles, taken from the indigenous collective estates and privatized for the market. This dispersal of landless settler populations from east of the Mississippi served as an escape valve, lessening the likelihood of class conflict as the Industrial Revolution accelerated the use of cheap immigrant labor. That's an important sentence, and I want to read it again. This dispersal of landless settler populations from east of the Mississippi, so the older states, more established part of the United States, served as an escape valve, lessening the likelihood of class conflict within those more settled parts of the U.S. as the Industrial Revolution accelerated the use of cheap immigrant labor. In other words, don't think about staying in these established states and fighting for your class interests. Go take some cheap land that we will provide to you as, one of the fruits of the genocide that the U.S. government, have been carrying out. So, this is part of why we need to learn these things as communists. In any settler, in understanding any kind of settler colonial type of situation, whether it's the United States or Canada or Israel. We recently read a piece by Posadas talking about the Palestinian and Israeli masses uniting, and it's like, I don't know what Israel you're looking at, but you have the same problem where what is in their interests? I mean, you could say morally it would be better for the Israelis to unite with the Palestinians, and indeed some do, I think probably before they get completely disgusted with the overall situation and maybe how little progress they're making, and sort of abandon that whole tack one way or another. But you basically have the Israeli or the U.S. or whatever colonial settler government, saying to its proletariat, like, here, we will bribe you with this land. Don't attack us. We, the capitalist ruling class, don't attack us. Here, attack these defenseless people and we'll give you their land. So, think about it. It's not like as clear cut as some of these, quote, right-wing communists are trying to make it out to be. And, are they meaning to be right-wing? I think some of them are. That's a whole other conversation. Some of them wind up with default right-wing positions because they just haven't thought about this enough. So this is one of the things we're trying to avoid by expanding this conversation more. You cannot just simply try to apply, standard Marxist logic to the assumptions of what U.S. history is about, because those assumptions are wrong. There's nothing wrong with Marxism. It's just you can't apply that logic of just simple class struggle to a situation with the kind of dimensions that the U.S. has. This was a very good example. Why don't you get more class struggle? Well, people thought maybe if I just go west, then, they did that instead of engaging in class struggle at this particular time. So there's complicating things here. You can't just look at it simply in terms of, what was happening within Ohio at this time, or what was happening within Tennessee. You have to look at the broader context. All right, back to the text. Little of the land appropriated under the Homestead Acts was distributed to actual single-family homesteaders. It was passed instead to large operators or land speculators. The land laws appeared to have been created for that result. An individual could acquire 1,120 or even more acres of land. Even though homestead and preemption, legalized squatting claims, were limited to 160 acres. A claimant could obtain a homestead and secure title after 5 years or pay cash within 6 months. Then he could acquire another 160 acres under preemption by living on another piece of land for 6 months and paying $1.25 per acre. While acquiring these titles, he could also be fulfilling requirements for a timber culture claim of 160 acres and a desert land claim of 640 acres, neither of which required occupancy for title. Other men within a family or other partners in an enterprise could take out additional desert land claims to increase their holdings even more. As industrialization quickened, land as a commodity, real estate, remained the basis of the U.S. economy and capital accumulation. The federal land grants to the railroad barons, carved out of indigenous territories, were not limited to the width of the railroad tracks, but rather formed a checkerboard of square-mile sections stretching for dozens of miles on both sides of the right-of-way. This was land the railroads were free to sell in parcels for their own profit. The 1863-64 Federal Banking Acts mandated a national currency, chartered banks, and permitted the government to guarantee bonds. As war profiteers, financiers, and industrialists such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan used these laws to amass wealth in the East, Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker in the West grew rich from building railroads with Eastern capital on land granted by the U.S. government. Indigenous nations, as well as Hispanos, resisted the arrival of railroads crisscrossing their farms, hunting grounds, and homelands, bringing settlers, cattle, barbed wire fencing, and mercenary buffalo hunters in their wake. In what proved a prelude to the genocidal decades to follow, the Andrew Johnson administration, in 1867-68, sent army and diplomatic representatives to negotiate peace treaties with dozens of indigenous nations. The 371 treaties between indigenous nations and the United States were all promulgated during the first century of U.S. existence. Congress halted formal treaty making in 1871, attaching a rider to the Indian Appropriation Act of that year stipulating, quote, that hereafter no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty, provided further that nothing therein contained shall be construed to invalidate or impair the obligation of any treaty heretofore lawfully made and ratified with any such Indian nation or tribe, unquote. This measure meant that Congress and the President could now make laws affecting an indigenous nation with or without negotiations or consent. Nevertheless, the provision reaffirmed the sovereign legal status of those indigenous nations which had treaties. During the period of U.S. indigenous treaty making, approximately 2 million squares of land passed from indigenous nations to the United States, some of it through treaty agreements, and some through breach of standing treaties. In an effort to create indigenous economic dependency and compliance in land transfers, the U.S. policy directed the Army to destroy the basic economic base of the Plains nations, the buffalo. The buffalo were killed to near extinction, tens of millions dead within a few decades, and only a few hundred left by the 1880s. Commercial hunters wanted only the skins, so they left the rest of the animal to rot. Bones would be gathered and shipped to the East for various uses. Mainly, it was the Army that helped to realize the slaughter of the herds. Old Lady Horse of the Kiowa Nation could have been speaking for all the Buffalo Nations in her lament of the loss. Quote, everything the Kiowas had came from the buffalo. Most of all, the buffalo was part of the Kiowa religion. A white buffalo calf must be sacrificed in the Sundance. The priests used parts of the buffalo to make their prayers when they healed people or when they sang to the powers above. So when the white man wanted to build railroads, or when they wanted to farm or raise cattle, The buffalo still protected the Kiowas. They tore up the railroad tracks and the gardens. They chased the cattle off the ranges. The buffalo loved their people as much as the Kiowas loved them. There was war between the buffalo and the white men. The white men built forts in the Kiowa country, and the woolly-headed buffalo soldiers shot the buffalo as fast as they could, but the buffalo kept coming on, even into the post cemetery at Fort Sill. Soldiers were not enough to hold them back. Then the white men hired hunters to do nothing but to kill the buffalo. Up and down the plains those men ranged, shooting sometimes as many as 100 buffalo a day. Behind them came the skinners with their wagons. They piled the hides and bones into the wagons until they were full, and then they took their loads to the new railroad stations that were being built, to be shipped east to the market. Sometimes there would be a pile of bones as high as a man, stretching a mile along the railroad track. The buffalo saw that their day was over, that they could protect their people no longer, unquote. Another aspect of U.S. economic development that affected the indigenous nations of the West was merchant domination. All over the world, in European colonies distant from their ruling centers, mercantile capitalists flourished alongside industrial capitalists and militaries, and together they determined the mode of colonization. Mercantile houses, usually family-owned, were organized to carry goods over long stretches of water or sparsely populated lands to their destinations. The merchant sources of commodities in remote regions were the nearby small farmers, loggers, trappers, and specialists such as woodworkers and metalsmiths. The commodities were then sent to industrial centers for credit against which money could be drawn. Thus, in the absence of a system of indirect credit, merchants could acquire scarce currency for the purchase of foreign goods. The merchant thereby became the dominant source of credit for the small operator as well as for the local capitalist. Mercantile capitalism thrived in colonial areas, with many of the first merchant houses originating in the Levant among Syrians, Lebanese, and Jews. Even as mercantile capitalism waned in the 20th century, it left its mark on native reservations where the people relied on trading posts for credit, a market for their products, and commodities of all kinds, an opportunity for super-exploitation. Merchants and traders, often by intermarrying indigenous women, also came to dominate native governance on some reservations. As noted above, at the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Army hardly missed a beat before the war to win the West began in full force. As a far more advanced killing machine, and with seasoned troops, the Army began the slaughter of people, buffalo, and the land itself, destroying the natural tall grasses of the plains and planting short grasses for cattle, eventually leading to the loss of the topsoil 4 decades later. William Tecumseh Sherman came out of the Civil War a major general and soon commanded the U.S. Army, replacing war hero Ulysses S. Grant when Grant became president in 1869. As commanding general through 1883, Sherman was responsible for the genocidal wars against the resistant indigenous nations of the West. Sherman's family was among the first generation of settlers who rushed to the Ohio Valley region after the total war that drove the people of the Shawnee Nation out of their homes, towns, and farms. Sherman's father gave his son the trophy name Tecumseh after the Shawnee leader who was killed by the U.S. Army. The general had been a successful lawyer and banker in San Francisco and New York before he turned to a military career. During the Civil War, most famously in the Siege of Atlanta, he made his mark as a proponent and practitioner of total war, scorched earth campaigns against civilians, particularly targeting their food supplies. This had long been the colonial and U.S. American way of war against the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. Sherman sent an army commission to England to study English colonial campaigns worldwide, looking to employ successful English tactics for the U.S. wars against indigenous peoples. In Washington, Sherman had to contend with the upper echelons of the military that were under the sway of Karl von Clausewitz's book on war, which dealt with conflict between European nation-states with standing armies. This dichotomy of training the U.S. military for standard European warfare, but also training it in colonial counterinsurgency methods, continues in the 21st century. Although a man of war, Sherman, like most in the U.S. ruling class, was an entrepreneur at heart, and his mandate as head of the army and his passion were to protect the Anglo conquest of the West. Sherman regarded railroads a top priority. In a letter to Grant in 1867, he wrote, quote, "We are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians stop the progress of the railroads," unquote. An alliance of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations was blocking the Bozeman Trail, over which thousands of crazed gold seekers crashed through indigenous territories in the Dakotas and Wyoming in 1866 to reach newly discovered gold fields in Montana. The Army arrived to protect them, and in preparation for constructing Fort Phil Kearny, Lieutenant Colonel William Fetterman led 80 soldiers to clear out the trail in December 1866. The Indigenous alliance defeated them in battle. Strangely, this being war, the defeat of the U.S. Army in the battle has come down in historical annals as the Fetterman Massacre. Following this event, General Sherman wrote to Grant, who was still Army commander, quote, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children," unquote. Sherman made it clear that, quote, "During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even to discriminate as to age," unquote. In adopting total war in the West, Sherman brought in its most notorious avatar, George Armstrong Custer, who proved his mettle right away by leading an attack on unarmed civilians on November 27, 1868, at the Southern Cheyenne Reservation at Washita Creek in Indian Territory. Earlier, at the Colorado Volunteers' 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, the Cheyenne leader Black Kettle had escaped death. He and other Cheyenne survivors were then forced to leave Colorado Territory for a reservation in Indian Territory. Some young Cheyenne men, determined to resist reservation confinement and hunger, decided to hunt and to fight back with guerrilla tactics. Since the Army was rarely able to capture them, Custer resorted to total war, murdering the incarcerated mothers, wives, children, and elders. When Black Kettle received word from Indigenous spies within the Army ranks that the mounted troops of the 7th Cavalry were leaving their fort and headed for the Washita Reservation, he and his wife rode out at dawn in a snowstorm, unarmed, to attempt to talk with Custer and assure him that no resistors were present on the reservation. Upon Black Kettle's approaching the troops with a hoisted white flag, Custer ordered the soldiers to fire, and a moment later, Black Kettle and his wife lay dead. All told, the 7th Cavalry murdered over 100 Cheyenne women and children that day, taking ghoulish trophies afterwards. Colonial Soldiers. Many of the intensive genocidal campaigns against indigenous civilians took place during the administration of President Grant, 1869 to 77. In 1866, 2 years before Grant's election, Congress had created 2 all-African-American cavalry regiments that came to be called the Buffalo Soldiers. Some 4 million formerly enslaved Africans were free citizens in 1865, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, which had taken effect in January 1863. The legislation was intended to have a demoralizing effect on the CSA, but it gave belated official recognition to what was already fact. Many African Americans, especially young men, had freed themselves by fleeing servitude and joining Union forces. Up to 1862, Africans had been barred from serving in their own capacity in the military. Now the Union Army incorporated them, but at lower pay, and in segregated units under white officers. The War Department created the Federal Bureau of Colored Troops, and 100,000 armed Africans served in the unit. Their courage and commitment made them the best and most effective fighters, although they had the highest mortality rate. At the end of the Civil War, 186,000 black soldiers had fought, and 38,000 had died in combat and from disease, a higher death toll than that of any individual state. The state with the highest casualty count was New York, with troops comprising mostly poor, white immigrant soldiers, largely Irish. After the war, many black soldiers, like their poor white counterparts, remained in the Army and were assigned to segregated regiments sent west to crush indigenous resistance. This reality strikes many as tragic, as if oppressed former slaves and indigenous peoples, being subjected to genocidal warfare, should magically be unified against their common enemy, quote, the white man. In fact, this is precisely how colonialism in general, and colonial warfare in particular, work. It is not unique to the United States, but rather is a part of the tradition of European colonialism since the Roman legions. The British organized whole armies of ethnic troops in South and Southwestern Asia, the most famous being the Gurkhas from Nepal, who fought as recently as Margaret Thatcher's war against Argentina in 1983. The Buffalo Soldiers were such a specially organized colonial military unit. As Stanford L. Davis, a descendant of a Buffalo Soldier, writes, quote, "Slaves and the black soldiers, who couldn't read or write, had no idea of the historical deprivations and the frequent genocidal intent of the U.S. government toward Native Americans. Free blacks, whether they could read or write, generally had no access to first-hand or second-hand unbiased information on that relationship. Most whites who had access often didn't really care about the situation. It was business as usual in the name of manifest destiny. Most Americans viewed the Indians as incorrigible and non-reformable savages. Those closest to the warring factions or who were threatened by it naturally wanted government protection at any cost." Unquote. Many black men opted for Army service for survival reasons, as it gave them food and shelter, pay and a pension, and even some glory. The United States had its own motives for assigning black troops to the West. Southerners and the Eastern population didn't want thousands of armed black soldiers in their communities. There was also fear that if they demobilized, the labor market would be flooded. For U.S. authorities, it was a good way of getting rid of the black soldiers and the Indians. The Civil War also set the template for the rapid Americanization of immigrants. Jewish immigrants fought on both sides in the war, and as individuals, they earned a level of freedom from U.S. bigotry that they had never experienced before. Indian scouts and soldiers were essential to the Army as well, both as individuals and as nations making war on other indigenous nations. Many decades later, Native Americans have continued to volunteer in U.S. wars in percentages far beyond their populations. Wichita Nation citizen Stan Holder appeared in a 1974 documentary film on the Vietnam War, Hearts and Minds, in which he explained his volunteering for service. While growing up, he had heard the older people's stories about Wichita warriors, and looking around, the only warriors he could identify were Marines, so he enlisted in what he considered a warrior society. It's no accident that the U.S. Marine Corps evokes that image in angry young men. As with black men who volunteered in the Indian Wars and enlisted and served in other wars, Native men seized the security and potential glory of the colonialist army. The explicit purpose of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Army of the West as a whole was to invade indigenous lands and ethnically cleanse them for Anglo settlement and commerce. As Native historian Jace Weaver has written, quote, "The Indian Wars were not fought by the blindingly white American cavalry of John Ford Westerns, but by African Americans and Irish and German immigrants," unquote. The haunting Bob Marley song Buffalo Soldier captures the colonial experience in the United States. Quote, "Said he was a Buffalo Soldier, win the war for America," unquote. The Army of the West was a colonial army with all the problems of colonial armies and foreign occupation, principally being hated by the people living under occupation. It's no surprise that the U.S. military uses the term Indian country to refer to what it considers enemy territory. Much as in the Vietnam War, the 1980s covert wars in Central America, and the wars of the early 21st century in Muslim countries, counterinsurgent army volunteers in the late 19th century U.S. West had to rely heavily on intelligence from those native to the land, informers and scouts. Many of these were double agents, reporting back to their own people, having joined the U.S. Army for that purpose. Failing to find guerrilla fighters, the Army resorted to scorched earth campaigns, starvation, attacks on, and removals of civilian populations, the weapons of counterinsurgency warfare. During the Soviet counterinsurgency in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees called the effect migratory genocide, an apt term to apply retrospectively to the 19th century U.S. counterinsurgency against indigenous peoples. Annihilation unto total surrender. The U.S. Army's search and destroy missions and forced relocations or ethnic cleansing in the West are well documented, but perhaps not normally considered in the light of counterinsurgency. Marie Sandoz recorded one such story in her 1953 best-selling work of nonfiction, Cheyenne Autumn, on which John Ford based a 1964 film. In 1878, the great Cheyenne resistance leaders, Little Wolf and Dull Knife, led more than 300 Cheyenne civilians from a military reservation in Indian Territory, where they had been forcibly confined to their original homeland in what is today Wyoming and Montana. They were eventually intercepted by the military, but only following a dramatic chase covered by newspaper reporters. So much sympathy was aroused in eastern cities that the Cheyennes were provided a reservation in a part of their original homeland. A similar feat was that of the Nime-Ipu Nez Perce under Chief Joseph, who tried to lead his people out of military incarceration in Idaho to exile in Canada. In 1877, pursued by 2,000 soldiers of the U.S. cavalry, led by Nelson Miles, Nime-Ipu led 800 civilians toward the Canadian border. They held out for nearly 4 months, evading the soldiers as well as fighting hit-and-run battles while covering 1,700 miles. Some were rounded up and placed in Pauls Valley, Oklahoma, but they soon left on their own and returned to their Idaho homeland, eventually securing a small reservation there. The longest military counterinsurgency in U.S. history was the War on the Apache Nation, 1850 to 86. Goyathale, known as Geronimo, famously led the final decade of Apache resistance. The Apaches and their Diné relatives, the Navajos, did not miss a beat in continuing resistance to colonial domination when the United States annexed their territory as a part of the half of Mexico taken in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo between the United States and Mexico, which sealed the transfer of territory, even stipulated that both parties were required to fight the, quote, savage Apaches. By 1877, the Army had forced most Apaches into inhospitable desert reservations. Led by Geronimo, Chiricahua Apaches resisted incarceration in the San Carlos Reservation designated for them in Arizona. When Geronimo finally surrendered, he was never captured. The group numbered only 38, most of them women and children, with 5,000 soldiers in pursuit, which meant that the insurgents had wide support both north and south of the recently drawn U.S.-Mexico border. Guerrilla warfare persists only if it has deep roots in the people being represented, the reason it is sometimes called People's War. Obviously, the Apache resistance was not a military threat to the United States, but rather a symbol of resistance and freedom. Herein lies the essence of counterinsurgent colonialist warfare. No resistance can be tolerated. Historian William Appleman Williams aptly described the U.S. imperative as, quote, annihilation unto total surrender, unquote. Geronimo and 300 other Chiricahuas, who were not even part of the fighting force, were rounded up and transported by train under military guard to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, to join hundreds of other Plains Indian fighters already incarcerated there. Remarkably, Geronimo negotiated an agreement with the United States so that he and his band would surrender as prisoners of war rather than as common criminals as the Texas Rangers desired, which would have meant executions by civil authorities. The POW status validated Apache sovereignty and made the captives eligible for treatment according to the international laws of war. Geronimo and his people were transferred again to the Army base at Fort Sill in Indian Territory and lived out their lives there. The U.S. government had not yet created the term unlawful combatant, which it would do in the early 21st century, depriving legitimate prisoners of war fair treatment under international law. During the Grant administration, the United States began experimenting with new colonial institutions, the most pernicious of which were the boarding schools, modeled on Fort Marion Prison. In 1875, Captain Richard Henry Pratt was in charge of transporting 72 captive Cheyenne and other Plains Indian warriors from the west to Fort Marion, an old Spanish fortress, dark and dank. After the captives were left shackled for a period in a dungeon, Pratt took their clothes away, had their hair cut, dressed them in army uniforms, and drilled them like soldiers. Quote, "Kill the Indian and save the man," was Pratt's motto. This successful experiment led Pratt to establish the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879, the prototype for the many militaristic federal boarding schools set up across the continent soon after, augmented by dozens of Christian missionary boarding schools. The decision to establish Carlisle and other off-reservation boarding schools was made by the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs, later renamed the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA. The stated goal of the project was assimilation. Indigenous children were prohibited from speaking their mother tongues or practicing their religions while being indoctrinated in Christianity. As in the Spanish missions in California, in the U.S. boarding schools the children were beaten for speaking their own languages, among other infractions that expressed their humanity. Although stripped of the languages and skills of their communities, what they learned in boarding school was useless for the purposes of effective assimilation, creating multiple lost generations of traumatized individuals. Just before the centennial of U.S. independence, in late June 1876, then Lieutenant Colonel Custer, commanding 225 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, prepared to launch a military assault on the civilians living in a cluster of Sioux and Cheyenne villages that lay along the Little Bighorn River. Led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were ready for the assault and wiped out the assailants, including Custer, who after death was promoted to general. The proud author of multiple massacres of indigenous civilians, starting during the Civil War with his assault on unarmed and reservation incarcerated Cheyennes on the Washita in Indian Territory, Custer, quote, died for your colonialist sins, in the words of Vine Deloria Jr. A year later, Crazy Horse was captured and imprisoned, then killed trying to escape. He was 35 years old. Crazy Horse was a new kind of leader to emerge after the Civil War, at the beginning of the Army's wars of annihilation in the northern plains and the Southwest. Born in 1842, in the shadow of the sacred Pahasapa, Black Hills, he was considered special, a quiet and brooding child. Already, the effects of colonialism were present among his people, particularly alcoholism and missionary influence. Crazy Horse became a part of the Akasita, a traditional Sioux society that kept order in villages and during migrations. It also had authority to make certain that the hereditary chiefs were doing their duty and dealt harshly with those who did not. Increasingly during Crazy Horse's youth, the primary concern was the immigrant defilement of the Sioux territory. A steady stream of Euro-American migrants clotted the trail to Oregon Territory. Young militant Sioux wished to drive them away, but the Sioux were now dependent on the trail for supplies. In 1849, the Army arrived and planted a base, Fort Laramie, in Sioux territory. Sporadic fighting broke out, leading to treaty meetings and agreements, most of which were bogus Army documents signed by unauthorized individuals. Crazy Horse was a natural in guerrilla warfare, becoming legendary among his people. Although Crazy Horse and other militants did not approve of the 1868 U.S. treaty with the Sioux, some stability held until Custer's soldiers found gold in the Black Hills. Then, a gold rush was on, with hordes of prospectors from all over, converging and running rampant over the Sioux. The treaty had ostensibly been a guarantee that such would not occur. Soon after, the Battle of the Little Bighorn put an end to Custer, but not to the invasion. Indigenous peoples in the West continued to resist, and the soldiers kept hunting them down, incarcerating them, massacring civilians, removing them, and stealing their children to haul off to faraway boarding schools. The Apache, Kiowa, Sioux, Ute, Kickapoo, Comanche, Cheyenne, and other nations were attacked, leaving community after community decimated. By the 1890s, although some military assaults on indigenous communities and valiant indigenous armed resistance continued, most of the surviving indigenous refugees were confined to federal reservations, their children transported to distant boarding schools to unlearn their indigenousness. Ghost dancing. Disarmed, held in concentration camps, their children taken away, half starved, the indigenous peoples of the West found a form of resistance that spread like wildfire in all directions from its source, thanks to a Paiute holy man, Wovoka, in Nevada. Pilgrims journeyed to hear his message and to receive directions on how to perform the ghost dance, which promised to restore the indigenous world as it was before colonialism, making the invaders disappear and the buffalo return. It was a simple dance performed by everyone, requiring only a specific kind of shirt that was to protect the dancers from gunfire. In the 20th century, Sioux anthropologist Ella Deloria interviewed a 60-year-old Sioux man who remembered the ghost dance he had witnessed 50 years before as a boy. Quote, "Some 50 of us, little boys about 8 to 10, started out across country over hills and valleys, running all night. I know now that we ran almost 30 miles. There on the Porcupine Creek, thousands of Dakota people were in camp, all hurrying about very purposefully. In a long sweat lodge with openings at both ends, People were being purified in great companies for the holy dance, men by themselves and women by themselves, of course. The people, wearing the sacred shirts and feathers, now formed a ring. We were in it. All joined hands. Everyone was respectful and quiet, expecting something wonderful to happen. It was not a glad time, though. All wailed cautiously and in awe, feeling their dead were close at hand. The leaders beat time and sang as the people danced, going round to the left in a sidewise step. They danced without rest, on, and they got out of breath, but they still kept going as long as possible. Occasionally, someone thoroughly exhausted and dizzy fell unconscious into the center and lay there, quote, dead. Quickly, those on each side of him closed the gap and went right on. After a while, many lay about in that condition. They were now, quote, dead and seeing their dear ones. As each one came to, she or he, slowing, sat up and looked about, bewildered, and then began wailing inconsolably. Waking to the drab and wretched present, after such a glowing vision, it was little wonder that they wailed as if their poor hearts would break in two with disillusionment. But at least they had seen. The people went on, and could not stop, day or night, hoping perhaps to get a vision of their own dead, or at least to hear the visions of others. They preferred that to rest or food or sleep, and so I suppose the authorities did think they were crazy, but they weren't. They were only terribly unhappy." Unquote. When the dancing began among the Sioux in 1890, reservation officials reported it as disturbing and unstoppable. They believed that it had been instigated by Hunkpapa Teton Sioux leader Tatanka Yotanka, Sitting Bull, who had returned with his people in 1881 from exile in Canada. He was put under arrest and imprisoned in his home, closely guarded by Indian police. Sitting Bull was killed by one of his captors on December 15, 1890. All indigenous individuals and groups living outside designated federal reservations were considered fomenters of disturbance, as the War Department put it. Following Sitting Bull's death, military warrants of arrest were issued for leaders such as Bigfoot, who was responsible for several hundred civilian refugees who had not yet turned themselves in to the designated Pine Ridge Reservation. When Bigfoot heard of Sitting Bull's death and that the army was looking for him and his people, 350 Lakotas, 230 of them women and children, he decided to lead them through the sub-zero weather to Pine Ridge to surrender. En route on foot, they encountered U.S. troops. The commander ordered that they be taken to the army camp at Wounded Knee Creek, where armed soldiers surrounded them. 2 Hotchkiss machine guns were mounted on the hillside, enough firepower to wipe out the whole group. During the night, Colonel James Forsyth and the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, arrived and took charge. These soldiers had not forgotten the Lakota relatives of these starving, unarmed refugees had killed Custer and decimated his troops at the Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. With orders to transport the refugees to a military stockade in Omaha, Forsyth added 2 more Hotchkiss guns trained on the camp, then issued whiskey to his officers. The following morning, December 29, 1890, the soldiers brought the captive men out from their campsites and called for all weapons to be turned in. Searching tents, soldiers confiscated tools such as axes and knives. Still not satisfied, the officers ordered skin searches. A Winchester rifle turned up. Its young owner didn't want to part with his beloved rifle, and when the soldiers grabbed him, the rifle fired a shot into the air. The killing began immediately. The Hotchkiss guns began firing a shell a second, mowing down everyone except a few who were able to run fast enough. 300 Sioux lay dead. 25 soldiers were killed in, quote, friendly fire. Bleeding survivors were dragged into a nearby church. Being Christmas time, the sanctuary was candlelit and decked with greenery. In the front, a banner read, "Peace on Earth and Goodwill to Men." The 7th Cavalry attack on a group of unarmed and starving Lakota refugees, attempting to reach Pine Ridge to accept reservation incarceration in the frozen days of December 1890, symbolizes the end of indigenous armed resistance in the United States. The slaughter is called a battle in U.S. military annals. Congressional Medals of Honor were bestowed on 20 of the soldiers involved. A monument was built at Fort Riley, Kansas, to honor the soldiers killed by friendly fire. A battle streamer was created to honor the event and added to other streamers that are displayed at the Pentagon, West Point, and Army bases throughout the world. L. Frank Baum, a Dakota Territory settler later famous for writing The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, edited the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer at the time. 5 days after the sickening event at Wounded Knee, on January 3rd, 1891, he wrote, quote, "The pioneer has before declared that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong, and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth," unquote. 3 weeks before the massacre, General Sherman had made clear that he regretted nothing of his 3 decades of carrying out genocide. In a press conference he held in New York City, he said, quote, "Injuns must either work or starve. They have never worked, they won't work now, and they will never work." A reporter asked, quote, "But should not the government supply them with enough to keep them from starvation?" Quote, "Why," Sherman asked in reply, "should the government support 260,000 able-bodied campers? No government that the world has ever seen has done such a thing," unquote. The reaction of one young man to Wounded Knee is representative but also extraordinary. Plenty Horses attended the Carlisle school from 1883 to 1888, returning home stripped of his language, facing the dire reality of the genocide of his people, with no traditional or modern means to make a living. He said, quote, "There was no chance to get employment, nothing for me to do whereby I could earn my board and clothes, no opportunity to learn more and remain with the whites. It disheartened me, and I went back to live as I had before going to school," unquote. Historian Philip Deloria notes, quote, "The greatest threat to the reservation program was the disciplined Indian who refused the gift of civilization and went back to the blanket, quote unquote, as Plenty Horses tried," unquote. But it wasn't simple for Plenty Horses to find his place. As Deloria points out, he had missed the essential period of Lakota education, which takes place between the ages of 14 and 19. Due to his absence and European-American influence, he was suspect among his own people, and even that world was disrupted by colonialist chaos and violence. Still, Plenty Horses returned to traditional dress, grew his hair long, and participated in the ghost dance. He also joined a band of armed resistors, and they were present at Pine Ridge on December 29, 1890, when the bloody bodies were brought in from the Wounded Knee Massacre. A week later, he went out with 40 other mounted warriors who accompanied Sioux leaders to meet Lieutenant Edward Casey for possible negotiations. The young warriors were angry, none more than Plenty Horses, who pulled out from the group and got behind Casey and shot him in the back of his head. Army officials had to think twice about charging Plenty Horses with murder. They were faced with the corollary of the recent Army massacre at Wounded Knee, in which the soldiers received Congressional Medals of Honor for their deeds. At trial, Plenty Horses was acquitted due to the state of war that existed. Acknowledging a state of war was essential in order to give legal cover to the massacre. As a late manifestation of military action against indigenous peoples, Wounded Knee stands out. Deloria notes that in the preceding years, the Indian warrior imagery so prevalent in U.S. American society was being replaced with, quote, "docile, pacified Indians started out on the road to civilization," unquote. Quoting again, Luther Standing Bear, for example, recounts numerous occasions on which the Carlisle Indian Industrial School students were displayed as docile and educable Indians. The Carlisle Band played at the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883 and then toured several churches. Students were carted around East Coast cities. Standing Bear himself was placed on display in Wanamaker's Philadelphia department store, locked in a glass cage in the center of the store and set to sorting and pricing jewelry, unquote. Greed is good. During the final phase of military conquest of the continent, surviving indigenous refugees were deposited in Indian territory, piled on top of each other in smaller and smaller reservations. In 1883, the first of several conferences were held in Mohonk, New York, of a group of influential and wealthy advocates of the Manifest Destiny policy. These self-styled, quote, "Friends of the Indians," developed a policy of assimilation, soon formulated into an act of Congress written by one of their members, Senator Henry Dawes, the General Allotment Act of 1887. Arguing for allotment of collectively held indigenous lands, Dawes said, quote, "The defect of the reservation system was apparent. It is Socialist Henry George's system, and under that, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, oh no. which is at the bottom of civilization. So that's the foundation of civilization, selfishness. Till this people will consent to give up their lands and divide among their citizens so that each can own the land he cultivates, they will not make much more progress, unquote. Although allotment did not create the desired selfishness, it did reduce the overall indigenous land base by half and furthered both indigenous impoverishment and U.S. control. In 1889, a part of Indian territory the federal government called the unassigned lands, left over after allotment, was opened to settler homesteading, triggering the Oklahoma Run. Oil had been discovered in Indian territory, but the Dawes Allotment Act could not be applied to the 5 indigenous nations removed from the South, because their territories were not technically reservations, rather sovereign nations. In contradiction to the terms of the removal treaties, Congress passed the Curtis Act in 1898, which unilaterally deposed the sovereignty of those nations and mandated allotment of their lands. Indigenous territories were larger than the sum of 160-acre allotments, so the remaining land after distribution was declared surplus and opened to homesteading. Allotment did not proceed in Indian territory without fierce resistance. Cherokee traditionalist Redbird Smith rallied his brethren to revive the Kituwa secret society. Besides direct action, they also sent lawyers to argue before Congress. When they were overridden, they formed a community in the Cookson Hills, refusing to participate in privatization. Similarly, the Muskogee Creeks resisted, led by Chito Harjo, who was lovingly nicknamed Crazy Snake. He led in the founding of an alternate government, with its capital a settlement they called Hickory Ground. More than 5,000 Muskogees were involved. Captured and jailed, when freed, Harjo led his people into the woods and carried on the fight for another decade. He was shot by federal troops in 1912, but the legacy of the Crazy Snake resistance remains a strong force in eastern Oklahoma. Muskogee historian Donald Fixico describes a contemporary enclave, quote, "There is a small creek town in Oklahoma which lies within the Creek Nation. The name of this town is Tlopthloco. Tlopthloco is a small independent community which operates almost independently. They are not very much dependent on the federal government, nor are they dependent on the Creek Nation, so they're kind of a renegade group," unquote. In 1907, Indian Territory was dissolved, and the state of Oklahoma entered the Union. Under the Dawes and Curtis Acts, privatization of indigenous territories was imposed on half of all federal reservations, with a loss of 3/4 of the indigenous land base that still existed after decades of army attacks and wanton land grabs. Allotment continued until 1934, when it was halted by the Indian Reorganization Act, but the land taken over was never restored, and its former owners were never compensated for their losses, leaving all the indigenous people of Oklahoma, except the Osage Nation, without effective collective territories and many families with no land at all. The Hopi Nation resisted allotment with partial success. In 1894, they petitioned the federal government with a letter signed by every leader and chief of the Hopi villages. Quote, "To the Washington chiefs, during the last 2 years, strangers have looked over our land with spyglasses and made marks upon it, and we know but little of what it means. As we believe that you have no wish to disturb our possessions, we want to tell you something about this Hopi land. None of us were asked that it should be measured into separate lots and given to individuals, for they would cause confusion. The family, the dwelling house, and the field are inseparable, because the woman is the heart of these, and they rest with her. Among us the family traces its kin from the mother, hence all its possessions are hers. The man builds the house, but the woman is the owner, because she repairs and preserves it. The man cultivates the field, but he renders its harvest into the woman's keeping, because upon her it rests to prepare the food, and the surplus of stores for barter demands upon her thrift. A man plants the fields of his wife, and the fields assigned to the children she bears, and informally he calls them his, although in fact they are not. Even of the fields which he inherits from his mother, its harvests he may dispose of at will, but the field itself he may not." Unquote. The petition continues, explaining the matriarchal communal society and why dividing it up for private ownership would be unthinkable. Washington authorities never replied, and the government continued to carve up the lands. finally giving up because of Hopi resistance. In the heart of New Mexico, the 19 indigenous city-states of the Pueblo Indians organized resistance under U.S. occupation, using the legal system as a means of survival, as they had under Spanish colonialism, and in their relationship with the Republic of Mexico. In the decades after they had lost their autonomous political status under Mexico and were counted as former Mexican citizens under U.S. law, both Hispanos and Anglo squatters encroached upon the Pueblos' ancestral lands. The only avenue for the Pueblos was to use the U.S. Court of Private Land Claims. The following report reflects their status in the eyes of the Anglo-American judiciary. Quote, occasionally the courtroom at Santa Fe would be enlivened by a squad of Indians who had journeyed thither from their distant pueblos as witnesses for their grant. These delegations were usually headed by the governor of their tribe, who exhibited great pride in striding up to the witness stand and being sworn on the Holy Cross, wearing a badge on his breast, a broad red sash around his waist, and clad in a white shirt, the full tail of which hung about his Antarctic zone like the skirt of a ballet dancer, and underneath which depended his baggy white muslin trousers, a la Chinese washi-washi. The grave and imperturbable bow which the governor gave to the judges on the bench in recognition of their equality with himself as official dignitaries, arrayed in that grotesque fashion, was enough to evoke a hilarious bray from a dead burro." Unquote. Without redress for their collective land rights under the Claims Court, the Pueblos had no chance but to seek federal Indian trust status. After they lost in their first attempt, finally in 1913, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the earlier decision and declared the Pueblos wards of the federal government with protected trust status, stating, quote, "They are essentially a simple, uninformed, inferior people," unquote. At the beginning of the 20th century, sculptor James Earl Fraser unveiled the monumental and iconic sculpture, The End of the Trail, which he had created exclusively for the triumphal 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco, California. The image of the near-naked, exhausted, dying Indian mounted on his equally exhausted horse proclaimed the final solution, the elimination of the indigenous peoples of the continent. The following year, Ishi, the California Yanni who had been held captive for 5 years by anthropologists who studied him, died and was proclaimed the last Indian. Dozens of other popular images of, quote, the vanishing Indian were displayed during this period. Gee, I wonder what happened to them. The film industry soon kicked in, and Indians were killed over and over again on screens viewed by millions of children, including Indian girls and boys. With utter military triumph on the continent, the United States then set out to dominate the world, but the indigenous peoples remained and persisted as the, quote, American century proceeded. So that's the end of chapter 8, and that is the end of this excerpt from An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. So I don't know what to say to the chauvinists and other communist patriots who think that the United States is like, this is just a small snapshot of the genocide that the U.S. carried out. The introduction and chapter 8 here of this book. I don't know what to say to these people. I mean, I know that you're probably cosplaying contrarian bullshitters, you know, talking about your patriotism and whatever, down to the fucking morons and just insanity of saying things like, you know, George Washington was the Mao of his people. The fuck is wrong with you? So it's offensive, it's insulting, and obviously, you know, the rest of us who are a little bit more aware of what the United States is all about will continue to amplify this history, and it will drown you out. But seriously, don't make this any harder than it has to be, I guess. Otherwise, for those sincerely interested in this information, what did you think? Leave a comment below. We will continue the discussion in the comments. Until then, thanks for watching. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. also materially helpful, so thank you for all of those donations. If you'd like to help out without a donation, liking, commenting, subscribing, clicking the notification bell, and sharing these videos in your social media all help to boost the channel, help more people to see this content. So thanks for doing that. Ultimately, whatever it is you do online and in your community to promote the message of socialism, thanks for doing it. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area, and we will catch you in the next video.